Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
At that time, the Lord appointed 72 others, whom he sent out ahead of him in pairs, to every town and place he intended to visit. He said to them, "The harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. So ask the master of the harvest to send out laborers for his harvest. Go on your way. Behold, I am sending you like lambs among wolves. Carry no money bag, no sack, no sandals, and greet no one along the way. Into whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this household.' If a peaceful person lives there, your peace will rest on him. But if not, it will return to you. Stay in the same house and eat and drink what is offered to you, for the laborer deserves his payment. Do not move from one house to another. Whatever town you enter and they welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick in it and say to them, 'The kingdom of God is at hand for you.' Whatever town you enter and they do not receive you, go out into the streets and say, 'The dust of your town that clings to our feet, even that we shake off against you.' Yet know this, the kingdom of God is at hand. I tell you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom on that day than for that town." The 72 returned, rejoicing, and said, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us because of your name." Jesus said, "I have observed Satan falling like lightning from the sky. Behold, I have given you the power to tread upon serpents and scorpions, and upon the full force of the enemy, and nothing will harm you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice because the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice because your names are written in heaven." My sisters and brothers, the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Jesus said, "Nevertheless, do not rejoice because you have power over evil spirits." That should not be the cause of your joy. But rejoice because your names are written in heaven. That's the message of Jesus today. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Not that Jesus has blessed us with all kinds of other things. This morning, it is my joy and privilege to preach the gospel to you. I do that every week I can, and you've heard me before, many of you. But this morning, I want to say a couple things about the gospel. I want to share with you a few comments that you might find helpful in clarifying this ancient message from Jesus of Nazareth. And one of the things that will help us is to have a definition as to what the word gospel means. Gospel is an old English word. It means Godspell. Have you ever heard of the word Godspell? And I think there was a musical written called Godspell at one time. Well, the word gospel in Old English is called Godspell. And it literally means glad tidings or good news, like a greeting card. And Some people want to know what the gospel is. Well, let me tell you what it's not. The gospel is not a philosophy. The gospel is not a list of rules for good morality, even though it speaks to these things. The gospel is not a philosophy. The gospel is not a plan of good advice that God is giving you, that you may live a happier life. That's not what the gospel is. So then, what is the gospel that we constantly talk about? It's a message, isn't it? No, it's not a written text, even though we write things down about the gospel. It's more than a written text. The gospel is a person. The message God has sent to the world is a message embodied in a person called Jesus of Nazareth. Do you hear what I'm saying to you? If you want to understand the gospel, look at the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and then you'll have the gospel. He himself in his very person is the message. My brothers and sisters, our faith is all about Jesus. It always was, and it always will be. He is the embodiment of the gospel. In Jesus, we receive an invitation by God himself to enter into that place where your name will be written down. That place that is where there will be a great gathering and a great feast, and you're one of the guests of honor that are going to be there. And so this is what the gospel is about. And Jesus is the living invitation to us. Now, Jesus had many disciples. He excited the people of his time with his message. He had hundreds, perhaps thousands of disciples. And his disciples can be divided into concentric circles. The innermost circle of Jesus' disciples involved 3 other people. You've heard of them before. One guy was named Simon Johnson. Remember I mentioned him earlier. And he was called Peter. And then there was another one, a second one, whose name was Jacob. And his name was James in English, but in Aramaic it's Jacob. And then there was a third one by the name of Jonah, who in English is called John. So Peter, James, and John were the inner circle of the disciples of Jesus. He had 3 of his closest disciples, which he poured his life in and he taught. And he took Peter, James, and John with him on special missions. So they were trained and formed well by the Master Jesus. And so that's the story of those 3 disciples. And then there was another circle of disciples around them, another concentric circle. And they were called the 12. And they were 12 men. They included people like Matthew, Thomas, and Philip, as well as Peter, James, and John. They made up the 12. Now, why did Jesus choose 12? Because 12 is a symbolic number, which means the people of God. That's what the number 12 is. It has a meaning. Numbers had meanings to the Hebrews. It meant different things. So 12 represented the people of God. So Jesus selected 12 disciples, like the 12 tribes of Israel. This was the new people of God that Jesus was raising up. And so this is important to keep in mind when we study the New Testament. Now, another concentric circle of disciples of Jesus that are mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, and only in Luke's Gospel, there was a circle of women disciples. Did you know that? Jesus also had women disciples. Sometimes that's forgotten. And the women disciples included Mary Magdalene, it included Mary and Martha, it included a lot of other women named Mary. You know, in the first century in Israel, almost every woman was named Mary. It kind of reminds me of the practice of the Irish. Remember? If you're Irish, you might remember this. Almost all the girls in Ireland are named Mary. What's different is they have a different last name, a middle name, so it's like Mary Beth or Mary Teresa. How many have heard of that? That's what they do in Ireland. Well, in the first century, most women were named Mary. How do you keep them straight? I suppose with a middle name. I don't know. You say Mary and about 25 women respond to you. Not a bad arrangement if you're a Hebrew man. Anyway, that's the story, and I'm sticking to it. Anyway, there was a circle of disciples around Jesus, which were women, and among them was Joanna, and Joanna was the wife of the prime minister of Israel. So the women disciples of Jesus were prominent, wealthy women, and they paid all the bills. So the men disciples had nothing to complain about. They had the women disciples who financed the ministry of Jesus. And another concentric circle of disciples was the 72, which we were introduced today in today's gospel. These are disciples that Jesus sends out to proclaim the gospel. They were to go to village ahead of Jesus and like a town crier say, the King is coming, Jesus is coming, the Messiah is coming, and you better be ready. And that was the message of the 72 that were sent out. And my brothers and sisters, we too are disciples of Jesus, even though we live 2,000 years later. We are another circle of disciples, and we too are called to proclaim the gospel. In other words, we're called to proclaim Jesus. I remember an old preacher who came to our church one time here at St. Matthew's, and he said to us, make friends with everybody, and then introduce them to your best friend, Jesus. That was his message, very simple, very direct and to the point, but that's really what it's about in the final analysis. The gospel, the good news of peace, is about Jesus and his person. And if we're in relationship with Jesus, then we are given the gift of peace, and our names are written in heaven. Now, that is good news, and that, my brothers and sisters, is the gospel of the Lord.
Amen.
Shall we stand together as we profess our faith?